want to welcome all of you to our first State of Democracy lecture and the first Campbell event, public Campbell event of 2013. I'm Grant Reherd, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. This afternoon, we're going to be dissecting a different kind of March Madness, the state of our political system. And to continue on that theme, I'll say with Tom Mann and Ira Shapiro, we're featuring two senior point guards with a lot of tournament experience between them. Before I say a few more words about them and the event, I want to offer some thanks first to the Dean's Office for supporting the series and for technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular Tom Fazio. Thanks as well to my colleague Elizabeth Cohen, who helps organize the series, and Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together these events. While I have you here, let me also invite you to some upcoming Campbell events. On Friday, April 5th at 7 p.m. in this very room, we will be sponsoring a debate on the New York SAFE Act. And then back in this room again on Friday, April 26th at this time, and also in this place, we'll be sponsoring our second State of Democracy event. It's a talk by Sister Simone Campbell of Network and of Nuns on the Bus fame. She'll be speaking on progressive politics and faith. It's kind of a bookend of sorts to the visit that we had from Arthur Brooks here last year. With Tom and Ira this afternoon, we will depart slightly from our traditional format. Each of them will speak briefly, and then I'll be joined by Len Berman, the Moynihan Chair of Public Affairs here at Maxwell, to continue the discussion. And perhaps if you'll permit one more March Madness allusion, I would say that, as you can see, Len is obviously well suited to be at the center of these discussions. Ooh, ow. After that, we'll ask you to join us, and we'll take your questions and your brief comments. And when we do, I just want to ask you to please wait for the microphone to be passed to you so that you're part of our archive and our live stream. And then after that, we'll all repair to the foyer for a nice reception where we can continue the conversation. Finally, I have one important request, and that's to silence all phones and ringing devices at this point. So now let me just say a couple additional words about our two main speakers. Tom Mann is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where he also holds the W. Averill Harriman Chair. He's a noted observer and commentator on national politics, and with Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, modeling bipartisanship, the two of them, he's the author of The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, and most recently, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. You sure you're going to say things are going to get better, right? Okay. Ira Shapiro, who will start us off, is an international trade lawyer. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Senate, serving in senior staff positions for a variety of prominent senators. He then went into the Clinton administration as a trade negotiator, reaching the rank of ambassador. He worked on NAFTA, the Uruguay Round, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and a global health treaty attached to the World Health Organization. He is the author of The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. So Tom and Ira, welcome to both of you, to Maxwell. And Ira, we'll start and we'll hear from you. So thanks.
Thank you, Grant. And it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the chance to be with Tom, who is one of the, perhaps the foremost expert on Congress in Washington for the last 40 years. He and Norm Ornstein have been terrific, and I've learned a lot from reading them. I also want to thank Jim Steinberg for inviting us. Jim is the dean, and as you know, but one of the great foreign policy practitioners and thinkers in the country, and he's an old friend. I served in the Senate in the 1970s and the 1980s, and had 12 years there and served in all kinds of positions and really found it was a wonderful experience. And then I went off and did other things. Fast forward to 2008, during the presidential campaign that was so exciting, a group of us who were friends came together to talk about the campaign. We had worked together in the Senate and 30 years before. And we talk about the presidential campaign, and then we turn to the Senate, how it had become unrecognizable to us, polarized, paralyzed, dysfunctional. And I walked out of one of those breakfasts and I said, I'm going to write a book about the Senate when it worked, when it was great. Now, when you do something like that, there's a few problems, one of which was it really great? Did it only seem great because we were there? Did it only seem great because we were young? And fortunately, as I got into it, it turned out for me that I had discovered something that was in plain sight and hadn't been noticed. If you Google the words Great Senate, you will find nothing other than my book. In fact, I was asked by a number of readers when I was writing this, prospective friends and readers, are you writing about Rome? But the truth is, it turns out that for a period of time in the 1960s and 70s, we had a great Senate. It was in the forefront of everything that went on in the country. At a time when 5 presidents failed to serve 2 terms, at a time of civil rights, war in Vietnam, political scandal, assassinations, difficult times for the country, the Senate stepped up to all kinds of challenges, all those major issues. You find the Senate at the forefront of it. And the lasting legislative contributions, ranging from civil rights to the environment, to consumers, to seniors, the Senate was at the center of everything. The Senate of Humphrey and Javits, and Howard Baker and Ted Kennedy and Bob Dole. There are people all over the country who still remember the senators of that time. So I tried to explain how it worked. And by the way, it's not political science, it's narrative history, so it's not boring. So I tried to explain how it worked. And I would distill a couple of things that I wanted to offer as in the preliminary comments. The first thing is those senators focused first and foremost on the national interest. They were members of parties, they represented their states very vigorously, but what was their North Star was the national interest. That's what they thought they were there for. That's what led to extended, intense debates and then principled compromise. They listened to each other. They were looking for solutions in the national interest. The second thing was they really believed in the Senate. They believed the Senate was a special institution and it was a place that was supposed to take collective action. So in that way, seeing it that way, filibusters were rare but real, or real but rare. Holds were short, not indefinite holds put on for anything. Straight party voting didn't really happen very much. Now, it's true, and as Tom has written brilliantly and will undoubtedly say, the parties weren't as far apart. We all know that. But their concept of being a senator, their concept of what the Senate was wholly different than what we've seen. Now, I could go on and tell many stories, but that would not fit into my introductory remarks. So the question usually becomes, what happened? How did we lose that Senate? And if we figure that out, how do we get it back? Can we get it back? And I think the answer is fairly clear that the great Senate of the 60s and 70s ended in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan and the sweeping out of many of the Democratic and Republican giants of the time who were replaced by a number of people, names that still resonate today: Paula Hawkins, Jim Abner, Jeremiah Denton. Who are these people? Those people who arrived in Washington with no accomplishments and left with their records still intact. But the story wasn't over yet, because there were still a lot of good senators that were there. And the Senate came back together in the 80s and started functioning again, sort of the way the Senate functions. And then in the 1990s, it started down. It started down, and it's been going down, in my estimation, for close to 20 years. And the factors that brought it down are familiar to many of you, and certainly Tom and Norm Ornstein have written brilliantly about them. But two factors are most important: the huge partisan divide between the parties, and the rise of what we would have called, and others have called, the permanent campaign. Used to be, when you had a campaign, the campaign ended, and then you got on with governing. Now the campaign never seems to end. The governing there's never a moment for governing because you're getting ready for the next campaign. So those two things together, and the names of the people who were instrumental, I won't mention them here, Newt Gingrich, Trent Lott. The names of the people who changed the system fundamentally, we all know. Why is this so important? From my standpoint, somebody said to me, well, of course you think the Senate's important. You wrote a book about it. I think the Senate's important because it's the balance wheel in the system. At its best, the Senate is what Walter Mondale called our nation's mediator, reconciling the differences, the place where the parties come together, where you resolve regional and ideological differences. But at its worst, and it's been at its worst for a long time, the Senate is our weakest political institution, most vulnerable. The bitterness of the House of Representatives combined with the arcane Senate rules. So the question of whether the state of our democracy, I would argue, very much turns on whether you have a healthy Senate. And we haven't had one for a long time. I will hold for our conversation the surprise ending to this, which is, as I told Tom, I find myself a relative optimist. That is, relative to everyone else I meet. And I think there are some reasons for it that we'll get into the discussion about.
Well, I think that was a wonderful start to our session here. What a delight to be with Ira. I can assure you that he's absolutely right. His book is not in the least bit boring. It's fascinating. The narrative history is compelling. It was as if I relived through a period of American politics, a period most of which I was in Washington, and that is the meat of Ira's book. And at either end, introduction, preface, and afterword, he really sort of sets the scene with a contemporary focus, and then draws on the experience of the Senate during that period to help us understand what's happened and what has really gone amiss. So there are no great fights for Ira and me to engage in here this afternoon. Grant may be disappointed, but I'll do my best to see if we can't do something about that. I was here about 6 years ago. I visited Syracuse and the Maxwell School and gave a talk in the democracy series. It was shortly after Norm and I did this book called The Broken Branch. That was a period in which we were getting to be frustrated by both branches and Congress in the American political system, the demise of regular order, the loss of a sense of the importance of the first branch of government, institutional loyalty, and a keen sense of responsibilities vis-a-vis the other parts of the system. And Norm and I played our normal, regular role of being nonpartisan analysts. We each, as all of us do, have our own personal political views, but Norm and I go back to graduate school at Michigan. We played tennis as well as did political analysis together, and we always sort of tried to remove ourselves from the immediate sort of politics and call them as we see them. And in this case, while we talked a lot about Newton, his contribution, it was a more generic book, but things indeed got worse. And it inspired us, along with an editor we had worked with 6 years earlier, to write a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Let me say, if we have to write a third volume, we've got a couple of possibilities for titles. So one is Run for Your Life. The other is 535 Shades of Gray. What do you think? Now, people ask, what do you mean it's even worse than it looks? How could it be even worse? It looks so bad. You know, the point is Congress is supposed to look bad. That is, that's the framers' conception of it. And one of the very unfortunate things about American democracy is that public disapproval of Congress is oftentimes based on an understanding that it's not supposed to be conflictual or messy or difficult. And they have it all wrong. They think everyone agrees about everything and they should just come together and ratify the agreement of the public, when in fact there's no agreement in the public. There are some political scientists who argue we have this moderate, pragmatic, bell-shaped curve of public opinion, everyone pretty much in agreement, but it's these political elites, these politicians, these members of Congress who are so extreme that they have ruined our politics through polarization. Sorry, but each of us is part of this story. We have become attached to one view or the other, one party or the other. We view politics through these lenses, and indeed, it makes it bad. And therefore, the sort of problem is that the public doesn't have a clue. They think it's just bad people doing the wrong things. When in fact it's much more fundamental and much more profound. Things got so bad over the last couple of years that the approval rating of Congress fell beneath 10%. It got into the single digits. You know, now it's running 10, 12%. I mean, the question I ask myself every day is, who are those 12%? What are they thinking? What are they approving of? Senator McCain attributes it to relatives and paid staff, which may have something to do. Here's why we came to feel it was much worse than we had seen during our 43 years in Washington. We had an opposition party wishing and working for government failure in a time of deep financial and economic crisis. That is to say, the political incentives driving the system led one of our political parties to effectively shut down the government after a pretty decisive election victory, shut it down in terms of disabling the ability of the new majority unified government to try to put a program in place to deal with that crisis. And then after the midterm election, when we had divided party government with one the House of Representatives controlled by the Republican Party, we saw an unprecedented use of the debt limit, the threat of public default to try to achieve policy objectives which shared two characteristics. One, its supporters were absolutely certain were just the thing that needed to be done, that is, immediate cuts in discretionary domestic spending. And secondly, that were absolutely wrong and made little sense for the country. And the kind of arguments that they made were not arguments, were not reasoned debate, but frankly were slogans, most of them with words provided by Frank Luntz, the wordmeister of the conservative movement. And it just got to be embarrassing. So it was both distressing, dysfunctional, and embarrassing. And as we thought about it, we said, people don't really understand out there what's going on and what the source of the problem is. So what did we conclude? Two reasons, two things wrong about our politics that have been causing us such problems. Now, we've had problems throughout our history. The founding period wasn't so hot. It was very tough. And our politics almost broke up during those early years of the Republic. The War of 1812 was declared by a partisan vote, and it was not a rational decision. The partisan warfare and physical violence in the lead up to the Civil War. But again, when I talk to people, I say, we don't want to use that as a model. But then again, near the end of the 19th century, the post-Reconstruction Gilded Age period saw sharp partisan polarization in our politics and growing dysfunction. We found our way out of each of these, some more easily than others. So I don't mean to say that we were longing for going back to a golden age, but each troublesome period has its unique problems, and we thought it was important to make that clear. And once you hear them, I think you will not be oh wow, I never thought of that. But sometimes the most obvious things need to be framed and formulated. First is a mismatch between our parties and our governing institutions. Our constitutional system, the institutions that have flowed from it, the norms and culture surrounding it, all require a kind of collaboration. Form of competitiveness and collaboration to make anything work. It's the nature of the system. There are things that minorities can use if they choose to bring government to a screeching halt. But for the most part, they don't do it. They don't use it. But when you have parties as we have now, and Ira mentioned that, we have parties that are internally relatively homogeneous in terms of their ideological commitments. That changes over time and varies, but it's striking the degree to which the parties are so far apart. Secondly, they're operating at a level of parity, which means that the permanent campaign is turned into a permanent war because each of them is in a position to win the White House, to win majority control in the House and the Senate, and therefore the legislative policy-making process has really turned into a strategic game of political warfare. You approach a policy not to solve a problem, but to improve your position for the next election so you can strengthen your hand to do what you really want to do if you control everything. In that sense, our parties are parliamentary parties. They're vehemently oppositional, and that's the way it's supposed to work. The party runs, the party that wins a majority in the election forms a government, either a single party or a coalition of parties, elects the prime minister, and then works together to put a program in place and is held accountable for it. Well, we've got the parliamentary parties, but we don't have the institutional means of allowing whoever happens to emerge from the election, the single party in our case, to actually put their program in place. Even in periods of unified party government, all it takes, there are many ways to slow the process down, but in the Senate, we have seen a dramatic change in the use of the filibuster, a promiscuous use of the filibuster such that the press now just accepts that as normal. It's as if the Constitution says all decisions made by the Senate shall be approved by 60% of those elected and sworn. It doesn't say that. The Constitution anticipates both chambers operating by majority rule, except for those specifically enumerated cases, approval of treaties, impeachment of presidents that require supermajority. It's a long and fascinating story that we may get into of how the filibuster started, but right now it was used during that 2 first years of the Obama presidency to defeat, when 60 votes for cloture were not there, to delay, to discredit, and eventually to nullify through filibusters of appointees to run agencies, of new programs that have been passed by the government. So we've got this terrible mismatch. We've got incentives for a party in the minority to work together, absolute discipline for the most part, to ensure government doesn't do anything, even in the midst of a crisis. And then you turn to divided party government with one house in the control of the minority, and it sees itself as Newt did when he won the '94 election, became Speaker of the House, as a prime minister in a parliamentary system of government. Well, that's not how it works. So that's number one, the mismatch. We really have a problem now with our parties and our institutions. The second is all of this partisan polarization that people talk about and scholars write about tends to be seen in symmetrical terms. Democrats have moved far to the left and Republicans far to the right, and if we can only find the moderate middle, the vital center, everything would be swimmingly. So we got all of these nonpartisan groups in Washington, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, fix the debt, no labels. I mean, they're all over. It's an assumption about the two parties that doesn't hold up in reality. The fact is that Democrats have had their time of going off base, but say 60s and 70s, early 70s, that the Republican Party has veered far to the right. Perhaps the most quoted line in our book, and I knew it when I drafted it for the introduction, the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy regime going back a century, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understandings of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. That last one may be the most serious of all. We thought we settled that in 1800 when we had the peaceful transfer power, but it's back with us. So that's the reality of our politics. I say it as an analyst. It's not partisan, but it's not balanced because the reality isn't balanced, and nothing in our politics will change until the public comes to see what has transpired and sends clear signals to the outlier, the insurgent outlier. Now, it's complicated by our system of elections, presidential and off-year elections, by uncompetitive congressional elections in which a primary threat from the right is much more important than 80% of the national population thinking otherwise. So it's very complicated, but in the end, we can talk about trying to change our electoral rules. We can try to change the institutional governing rules to make these two things more compatible. But what we really need to do is bring the Republican Party, a conservative Republican Party, back into the mainstream of American politics, working within a set of parameters that have been accepted by Democrats and Republicans for a good long while. We'll have our fights, we'll have our arguments, but facts are facts, and we'll treat them seriously, and we'll see what kind of a difference we can make. I conclude, and forgive me for running on long, is that the 2012 election sets the stage for the public to send signals, and we'll have an opportunity, I trust, over the next hour or so to talk about whether those signals were received and anything is looking up in Washington.
Thank you. So we're going to jump into that right now. I'm going to ask the question I was going to ask second first, and I know Len wants to ask you some questions about the budget, among other things. So both of you, in different ways, have made arguments that sound a lot to me sort of like supply side type of arguments in terms of understanding how things have gotten bad. It's the people in the institution, or in this case, the behavior of one party in particular. And I know that, Tom, you've also made some structural arguments about how all that happens. So the question is, if that's the way you're understanding the problem, then how on earth are you thinking this is going to get better? Because both of you have told me that you think this is going to get better. Is there something beyond the argument that it just can't get worse, that it's going to get better? Why do the two of you think somehow this is going to turn around?
Well, I termed myself a relative optimist. And frankly, I've spoken about my book and the Senate that we have today in about 18 states. And I'm the only optimist I've come across. But the reason I feel that way is actually twofold. And certainly Grant hit one point. The old Beatles song runs through my mind. I have to admit it's getting better. Can't get much worse. I mean, the 2 points. One, I believe the 2012 elections did send an emphatic signal. Not only was Barack Obama reelected by a clear margin, but the Senate was a national landslide. 25 out of 33 Senate seats went to the Democrats. They won in blue states, they won in purple states, they won in red states, they won everywhere. The only way to read that result is as a rejection of Tea Party extremism and Capitol Hill obstruction. Now, that's the only way that I believe the result can be read. But I also believe the Republicans, many of them, are reading it that way. Certainly, they're divided. We read that every day in the paper. You've got people going to CPAC making the argument, we weren't conservative enough. McCain was too liberal. Romney was too liberal. I don't think that's the prevailing view, though. You see every day divisions among the Republicans as some of them are trying to come to terms with what really happened. I think that the evidence of that is increasing number of situations where the Senate starts looking the way the Senate used to look, so that you have bipartisan groups of clusters of people working on immigration or gun control, or Democrats and Republicans saying the same thing about banks that are too big to fail and how they ought to be regulated or broken up. You can see evidence, sort of what I call the green shoots of bipartisanism. So that one thing is that the elections do matter, did matter, and have had an effect. The second thing, though, that I would add to it is don't underestimate how much the senators who were there and the ones that have been elected hate the institution that it has become. They know it's not supposed to be like this, and they want to change it. Now, I've suggested to them they could change it, but start by getting rid of their leaders. But they've kept their leaders. But I do believe they will hold their leaders to a different standard of the way the Senate runs. And the last thing, I don't want to filibuster, even though I'm from the Senate. The phrase regular order is constantly raised now, and it didn't used to be. And regular order means let's legislate the way we're supposed to. Let's have committees consider things. Let's put bills on the floor and then debate them. We've had a leader-driven system of partisanship, and I think they're going to break through and get away from that too.
One could have looked at the outcome of the election and say, well, we ended up pretty much where we started. We have Barack Obama in office, we have a Democratic Senate, and we have a Republican House. So what's the big deal? What's really changed? As Ira said, a pretty big signal was sent given the time. Republicans really believed they were going to win the presidential election. Their pollsters told them so, and it was we're going to lose to that guy with this economy. I mean, it's just impossible. So it was a real stunner, and the magnitude of the victory was pretty substantial. You know, Barack Obama's the first president since Dwight Eisenhower to win election and re-election with 51% or more of the popular vote. I mean, it was not insignificant, and the Electoral College victory was comfortable. He only missed North Carolina. The coalition remained largely intact. The 2000 election is explained by about a 20 percentage point difference in the turnout. It turns out the people who showed up in 2010 reported having voted for McCain in the election. It had so much, so it's the nature of our political system. The Senate, as Iris said, was quite smashing. There were so many vulnerable Democratic seats and so few Republican seats up. They thought they would gain seats and take back a majority. Instead, they lost 2 seats. And in the House, they won the popular vote as well by 1.4 million votes nationally. But a combination of Republicans having a more efficient distribution of voters across the country. They don't waste votes like Democrats do in urban areas with 80% majorities, super majorities. Add to that a successful partisan gerrymander, and they lost seats, but not the 25 they needed to hold on to it. So it sent a signal, but the signal was strongest among the Republicans who care about the White House because they look at their coalition and it's declining. All of the growing parts of the electorate, I'm thinking here of the non-whites, the Latinos, Asians, and other immigrant groups. I'm thinking about the millennial generation, the youngest cohort. I'm thinking about those with with college degrees and sort of professionals. And it suggests that Republicans could easily be marginalized. They've lost the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections. I mean, that's like the Democratic record during the period that led to the DLC and so on. So the hope stems from sort of a rationality about presidential politics, and that just controlling one or both houses of Congress, is not sufficient. You can't sustain, can't put in place a governing program, and the party's going to have to change dramatically if it is to win presidential elections. Now, the report the RNC put out was a little better than the NCPAC conference. Although immigration was the only issue that they really took on. They didn't touch any of their economic policies, although immigration has some economic implications. But the hope stems from the practical, dramatic shift on immigration that we see, and I think we now will get a comprehensive immigration bill through. It stems from a willingness to entertain the possibility of some new limits on guns, although that's a hard and difficult battle. It stems in part from a realization that the Republican brand has been devalued dramatically before and after this most recent election. And Republicans are riding about 20 percentage points below Democrats in terms of the favorability, and it just doesn't bode well for the party. So one hopes out of this will come a dynamic that would begin to allow other people to come forward, other voices that are conservative but more pragmatic. A Jeb Bush, a Mitch Daniels, John Huntsman. That doesn't go back to your great generation in the Senate, but these are smart, able people who are not ideological zealots, which is absolutely key. The other place the hope stems from, Grant, and I'll stop here, is that the House is hopeless and is only going to and it's not John Boehner. John Boehner is doing amazing things. What his way of surviving is to give voice to the crazies and show he's really with them. And then, so when he has to make some compromises and break the Hastert rule and let something come to the floor that doesn't have a majority support in his own conference, that he said, well, it could have been worse if we hadn't done this or that. Boehner's a real politician, a practical one, but it's awful to hear him. He says things that make absolutely no sense, but resonate with his party caucus. But the idea is Obama plays tough, not soft. He doesn't listen to Bob Woodward. He doesn't listen to the press saying he has to dine more frequently with Republicans and meet with them on a one-on-one basis. I've written that no amount of bourbon and branch water available at either end of Pennsylvania Avenue for constant meetings between individual Republicans and the president, or no amount of preemptive, bold offers on the budget by Obama, and then subsequent negotiations with Republican leaders will produce any positive outcomes. It's got to be hardball. It has to be tough. He has to have confidence in being able to speak out to the people, because in fact, public opinion is on his side on almost everything. Then he begins to work with a half dozen Republicans in the Senate, the Bob Corkers, the Lamar Alexanders, Susan Collins. There are Lindsey Grahams on some things. They're going to be frustrating, but they're tired of playing oppositional politics and nothing else. They want to do something. Corker was so discouraged when Mitch McConnell effectively took him out of the Dodd-Frank financial services reform negotiations at the end. He had invested huge amounts of time, as had a couple of other Republicans, but they pulled the plug on them and said no doing, and he was not a part of that. He'd like to be part of that. So I think the hope rides in unifying Democrats, building some agreement, not with Mitch McConnell, but with a half a dozen, 8, 10, 12 Republican senators, and then going to the House and putting the pressure on Boehner to bring it to the floor. That's how I see something happen. Those two forces, it's the electoral reality that they're facing and the need to rethink more than their message and the communications and the technology, but somehow you've got to burst, that's not the right metaphor. The no new tax pledge is one of the most destructive sort of political statements in our lifetime. It's really done great damage to the ability of the Senate, the House, the Congress, the government to sit down and talk and make some reasonable compromises on a set of problems that we face. It's got to be broken. It's got to be discredited. And in fact, public opinion is there with it. So at one level, you fight that. At the other level, you work with the handful of Republicans in the Senate who want to do something.
One of the things you mentioned in your remarks, Tom, is the fact that there are people in Congress, not all Republicans, but people in Congress who have a loose relationship with facts and evidence. Big problem we have is that people get their information from customized news sources, Fox, MSNBC, all of these internet channels. The person my chair is named after, Pat Moynihan, famously said that people are entitled to their own opinions but not their own facts. How do we get, I mean, I don't think we're going to get good policy until we can actually educate the public. I think the primaries, part of the problem is that you've got these pods of people who all believe the same thing. And that makes the other guys misguided and wrong and evil. How do facts break through?
Well, look, I think that one of the reasons it is a difficult situation, and one reason the House is different than the Senate, is a lot of those safe districts where there's no real incentive for people to consider the facts. They don't have to if they're Republicans. They're going to get elected anyway. The way the facts get through, though, is you basically have to marginalize the extremists. I mean, that's essentially what Tom was saying. You're finding a way to get things done with the people that are not extremists. And, the extremists will either fade from the scene, or at some point they'll pick up, like Senator Jim DeMint did, having tried to destroy the Senate. He looked at it and said, "This isn't worth being in. I want to go to to Heritage." So, but my argument would be,
a lot to raise the level of facts.
but my argument would be, you're not going to be able to convince everybody of everything or anything, but you've got to get back to a system that roughly resembles something like majority rule. The notion that, and I subscribe fully to what Tom was saying. I mean, I had started my book before, but the thing that galvanized public concern was the idea that Barack Obama could come into the presidency at a time of national economic crisis. We lost 750,000 jobs in 1 month, and he got no cooperation from the Republicans. That was quite amazing. Our whole story, our national narrative is we come together in times of crisis. So I think basically you have to reach out and find the people who are not crazy. And by the way, when I was making the point that the election has had some effects. Eric Cantor, Republican leader, far more moderate and focusing on other issues. He's a smart man. He knows that this thing isn't going anywhere good for him the way it was. Rick Scott, Tea Party governor of Florida, one of the real lunatics. He's going around the state talking about education reform, environmental protection, taking Medicaid funds from the federal government. People are not all that stupid. I mean, he's a person who is stepping up to the responsibility of governing and responding to what he's seeing in the political environment.
You're absolutely right. It's one of the most discouraging elements of American government today, the low esteem with which many participants hold facts and garner information, evidence that isn't simply part of the line, part of the spin. And you're right, the growth of the partisan media, and again, it did start on the right with Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and gravitated to Fox. MSNBC has some programs like that. Not all are like that, but it has some. You know, I'd put more of the burden on the establishment press because they're so consumed with telling the political story, the game. You know, wasn't that a clever move? And what's their strategy? And what are you going to do? That they will now, they don't differentiate between truth and untruth because they have to balance each side. So they get an advocate from this side and that side sort of telling their story, and then it's safe to them. So the public hears that. How are they supposed to? The reality is, in a small r Republican form of government, is that there is some division of labor. Most citizens don't invest huge amount of time, and we can try to improve our civics programs, and God, I've worked on that, and I hope we do, and I hope we get more people who are really interested now. I mean, the sources of information that's really good now, it's staggering. I've been in Washington many years, and it's never been higher. The quality, the tax policy center that's a joint center of the Urban Institute and Brookings. I mean, the work is superb, but I can give you a dozen blogs. Wonk Blog is one of the best of them, where they really try hard to play it straight, and it's politically sophisticated, but it's substantively rich and honest. That's got to begin to penetrate a mainstream press that is absolutely intimidated by potential charges of partisan bias, so that citizens out there who are looking for shorthand, for help in figuring out their way of what's going on and what's truthful and what isn't, we all need to help them. But let me tell you, this fact stuff is a more general problem. Bob Kaiser, a longtime Washington Post writer and editor, has finished a new book. It will be out in a few months. It's called Act of Congress. I think it's even worse than it looks. It's much, don't you think, livelier title than Act of Congress. It's a wonderful book, a case study of Dodd-Frank. And you learn much in this book, but one of the things you're reminded of, and Ira, I'd love to hear you on this, is Congress could not operate without a absolutely first-class staff. You remember what the Bible said, Jacob died leaning on his staff? Well, that staff wasn't strong enough. When Congress's staff is weak, when they bring in young ideologues and zealots, when they are looking for information that simply, as lawyers would do, make the case for a particular point of view, they're not doing their job. And to read how these Democratic and Republican staffs in the early stages sort of came together and worked, but then the leadership pulled the members away and out. But it was impressive. Dodd-Frank has a lot of Republican staff ideas. The people experienced in government, served in administration. There's still enough of them around to make that happen. But you've got, most of the members just simply didn't master the complexity of financial reform. Thank God that Barney Frank did. The people in the financial community were amazed that Barney was on top of this stuff and really knew it. I shudder to think if the next ranking members, any of them, had been the chairman, I don't think they could have pulled it off. Chris Dodd didn't have quite the intellectual depth, but he understood the issue, and he is the old-style great Senate master at playing the politics and looking to bring people along, and when fights emerge, you calm them down. It was a masterful performance by Dodd, who was determined to have Republican co-sponsors. In the end, they bailed, but he got enough Republican support to vote cloture and get the bill passed. But sadly, I think the number of members who, in both the House and the Senate now, who master their substantive specialties has declined. They're leaving us. Frank Church knew his stuff, boy. Bill Bradley knew his portfolio. Dave Obey knew his stuff. Barbara Conable was masterful from upstate New York, one of my idols. We dedicated the Broken Branch to in memory of Barbara Conable and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. These are, but you've got to have enough of those in positions whereby you can hire really able staff and do the work that, but that's necessary but not sufficient. You've got to free up the political system and the parties and the ideologues so that there is a market for new information and a willingness to compromise, and that's very hard to do.
Let's see what questions or comments we have at this point. And we've got the microphones. Who wants to go first? This has never happened before.
See, if no one will
This has never happened
offer
before.
the first question,
Gentlemen-
let's start with the second.
Gentleman over in the corner here.
Hi. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. So one of the things you've said is that, I heard you say it was that it would be, the president needs to find some people who aren't crazy to work with. And I guess the trouble I have with that is that I don't know that there are that many crazy people. I think there are just lots of people who are fundamentally uninterested in governing. So how do you, and when you think about that in the context of creating a market for new information, all the information in the world doesn't help you if you're not interested in governance. So how do you think you get the people who are being elected to be more interested in doing their job, which is not retaining their job necessarily?
I guess we shouldn't use terms like crazy. Yeah. I guess I would say that when I think about the Republicans particularly, I think there's a split between those people who are opposed to governing under any circumstances and others who are more moderate but have chosen for a period of time to line up with the party. I think that that's what the election breaks up a little bit. Those people, Tom mentioned some of the names, and I think there are more names, but those people are the ones who, having seen that extremism and obstruction simply gets you defeated, they will go back, presumably to being better than they were, you know. And I think that that is a possibility. I think that's starting to happen now.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm sure if the Senate has been promiscuous in its use of the filibuster, I've probably been careless in throwing around the words like crazy, and so I accept that corrective. Although we can show the video on a half dozen House Republicans that you would not believe the things that they are willing to say and believe, but it really isn't that. It's when a belief system overtakes you and you're not curious. You just don't believe any new information means you're compromising your principles and not willing to take this on, and that just counters the whole idea of a representative body, a legislative assembly. It's comparative advantage as opposed to, say, direct democracy, where people listen to the ads and then vote on initiative or proposition, where the give and take and the expertise is brought to bear. It's that which has been lost now because of the primacy of the voices of those. By the way, this didn't begin with Barack Obama. Anyone who lived through the Clinton years and saw what happened, not a single vote on the Republican side of the aisle, House or Senate, for Clinton's deficit reduction package, which ended up being a terrific success. But this has been going on for a long time. It's a belief in cutting taxes and dramatically scaling back government will solve our problems, and we can talk about that. I think in principle we can talk about the level of and nature of taxation and the appropriate roles for government, and that would be good. But if you believe it as a religion and not simply as a worldview, as an approach, a public philosophy, if it's a religion, then it's a sacrilege to even talk about it or to entertain any information. There are plenty of people for whom this is not a religion on the Republican side of the aisle in both bodies, such that if we change the mega politics, the openings would be there.
Got someone right behind. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Well, the analysis is wonderful and even a little hopeful. I wish the media, the establishment media, would pay more attention, and I wish you many speaking engagements. But I wonder if you say something about the possible role of ridicule, and how do you get even more coverage for Jon Stewart and other people who might be useful in just poking fun and ridiculing what is too extreme.
Well, I mean, look, a lot of us like Jon Stewart a lot, but I think I go back to my notion that the message is getting through. I think I use the elections as the most obvious example of a message getting through. I mean, the public stepped up, basically. You're not going to suppress our votes. You're not going to deprive us of the vote. We're not going to have Mitt Romney as our president. And by the way, Mitch McConnell, who had been measuring the drapes in the Senate Majority Leader's office for a long time, he not only didn't become Senate Majority Leader, but his poll numbers are among the lowest of any of the senators because he was transparently opposed to Obama. He said, as you know, famously, his highest objective was denying President Obama another term. He was so obvious in his contempt for Obama that he really suffered from it. So I think that there is some progress being made, but I want to just to comment so that one of the points up there made me think, you know, there's actually no real substitute for character among our leaders. People say, at one of my speaking things, somebody said, "You seem to think that the senators ought to rise above the vitriolic politics of today." I said, yeah, that's exactly what I seem to think. That's what they were supposed to do. That's what they've been elected to do. You do what you're supposed to do. Bob Corker, Tom made the good point about Bob Corker of Tennessee. Here's Corker, who works very hard, is a Republican, worked hard on the Dodd-Frank legislation, and someday Mitch McConnell summons him to the office and says, "You didn't get the memo, Bob. We're not helping the president do anything. We don't want any of this to come out, so you got to oppose it." Now that's a frustrating way for the system to work. His knuckling under is kind of frustrating too, right? I mean, when the leaders that I grew up with in the Senate would never have asked a senator to do that, and they wouldn't have asked a senator to do that because the senators would not have done it. And so the relationships were much different. People had a different kind of respect for each other, and that's got to be restored.
This really brings up the point that it's not just partisanship anymore, it's tribalism. And it goes well beyond, there has been a real decline in a sense of institutional loyalty, of national responsibility. It's tribes. You see it in things like, if Obama's for it, we're against it, even if we were for it before he was for it. Clearest way to kill any hope of Republican support is for Obama to announce his support for it. I mean, that's just a reality of our politics right now, and it gets reinforced by the sort of 24/7 and the internet, the blogs. I mean, a Republican saying anything accommodating about a thought and an idea coming from Obama, and he or she is vilified. And it's all over the conservative and Republican blogs, and the donors are calling, and so it's a very tough environment in which this happened. But I think you've really hit on something that's important. You said about the use of ridicule and in satire. I would add to that public shame, and I would add public square. The fact is, our civil society has kind of let us down. There were times when being CEO of a major corporation entailed some real responsibility for the welfare of the country, and instead of the next quarter's numbers. It really did. Show me a business leader that has spoken out in a constructive way. They were absolutely silent when the debt ceiling was taken hostage. It was the most reckless, unprecedented move in American politics. The rest of the world thought we were nuts, and yet no one spoke up. We used to be in a position where university presidents could do that, when religious leaders could do it, community leaders of nonprofit organizations. They've all let us down. Stephen Schwartzman, the head of one of the largest private equity firms, who has contributed many of his millions out of his billions of profits. When Obama sort of raised the idea of maybe the sort of carried interest treatment of income in private equity hedge funds, in which the partners are not putting up their capital, but it's simply their earnings, their work pay, that it should be treated as ordinary income and taxed at that level and not 15%. He said publicly, it reminds me of Hitler moving into Poland. I mean, this is from a prominent member. I mean, he rebuilt the New York Public Library and the Kennedy Center and probably something on campus here. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. But people like that get treated with respect, public shame. And Jon Stewart, by the way, we got on Jon Stewart. Our kids finally know what we're up to, you know? It was really nice. But Colbert's work with Citizens United and super PACs was brilliant and reached people that never had a clue as to what was going on. So I think you're right. We need new ways of capturing attention and pointing out when something is just absurd. They're just absurd. It ought to be discredited. I'm not talking about sort of serious conservative ideas that are put up as part of the reasonable political debate, but just absolutely preposterous, inaccurate, false claims.
So I have some students in my class here from my tax policy and politics class, and their assignment is to come up with a tax reform plan that could actually pass Congress, which of course is a challenge. But I thought you could help them. How do we get tax? Obviously, we need tax and entitlement reform. There seems to be, you know, in a less crazy world, there seems like an obvious compromise between the sides on that. How could we actually get it done?
It probably won't be anything like it was near the end of Reagan's term with 1986 tax reform, which we've been working in the years since to undermine. But instead, it'll, I think, be piecemeal as part of a set of suboptimal, not consensus or agreement, but shotgun weddings pushed by electorate, tired of manufactured crises and pseudo-conflict, and scared about their jobs and their earnings and the value of their pensions and their property and their hopes for the future. So I would sort of begin. I'm attracted actually to, as a starting point, some version of the proposal of Martin Feldstein, a Republican economist, which basically sort of limits across the board, percentage-wise, the amount of credits and deductions that you can take. So you could garner a huge amount of money out of that. You'd still have states that, you know, with higher taxes and people in the housing industry and elsewhere sort of resisting that. But since you're not singling them out and taking it all away, it's a practical way of dealing with that. Another thing is you can get more support in the public at large and potentially in the political process, even though it's not good tax policy, if you dedicate revenues. So the way to think about it is some kind of progressive consumption tax that's dedicated, say, that becomes the new Social Security or a source of support for a part of Medicare or whatever. You do something like that, and at the same time you can free up other revenues, but the net is positive. So that'd be another way I'd be inclined to go at it. But I really think the story has to go forward to the country. We are an aging society, not at a level of Japan or China or most of Europe, because we have immigrants coming in and our birth rate is, although it's gone down, it's still higher than these other countries. But our long-term deficits are a function of aging and healthcare cost inflation, longer term. And so first I banished the term entitlements. I talk about the specifics involved. In each of them, one can do reasonably. But I'd say to this, listen, if 3/5 to 2/3 of our long-term spending problem is associated with the aging of the population, directly or indirectly, then, you know, we can do a little more means testing of those benefits, but in the end, we're going to support those. So we're going to have 2 to 3% of GDP net more in income to be able to get through this period and retain a sort of a social safety net that most Americans take for granted now. I mean, we can trim it, we can fix it. Healthcare costs are a big deal. That's a mega problem, but we're at work on that now. And but we're going to need those revenues, and I think you could sell it on that basis in a decent society. And then you say, what is the best way of raising those revenues that would not lead the economy to grow at a slower rate? That is, how can you make more economically efficient the new taxes that you have to impose for this? And then it becomes a different kind of discussion. So those are the three things I'd suggest.
Go ahead, John.
Yes, I think one or both of you touched on this issue that perhaps some of the conservatives in the Senate or Congress saw the light as a result of the last election in terms of the popularity of Obama, perhaps, and the fact that the Senate is still predominantly Democratic. However, I see the trend happening where the conservatives on a state level, let's say local and state levels, are aggrandizing more power. They're learning how to take over governments. As an example, in places like Wisconsin, Ohio to some extent, Michigan, where the state governments have tried to weaken the power of organized labor. And that's a traditional base of the Democratic vote-getting efforts. And that could filter up to a national level and make it even more difficult for a more even playing field on a national level in the future. Comment on that.
Yeah, you want to go, Ira?
Go ahead.
It's a fascinating development. What you should understand is just how profoundly important 2010 election was, and the success in winning gubernatorial seats and winning legislatures and being in a position to strengthen the hand of the party across the board where redistricting is involved. But you know, it's a mixed group. Some of those Republican governors, like Mitch Daniels, are conservative but not ideological, and they're really pretty effective governors. They begin as ideologues, but as I was saying with Rick Scott, I mean, Chris Christie can have a lot of bombast, but boy, is he a politically sensitive governor, and he's not going to be ideologically extreme. He's going to make decisions that he thinks make sense for his state and for his own career. And so you're seeing Rick Snyder shows some of this in Michigan, and even in Wisconsin now. You're right, the attack on public employee unions is a big deal, and part of that now is because of the liabilities in the public pension funds and the big problems this causes for state finances. But you could see some of those states turning around and Democrats replacing some of the Republican governors this time, and other Republican governors emerging in a much more pragmatic way. The final thing I'd say is that if you want to see more pragmatic government, go to the metropolitan areas because there you're beginning to see the kind of coalitions of universities and corporations and government. I mean, they got problems, but they are sort of ahead of the curve as far as understanding their needs to build their infrastructure and their education systems and build a manufacturing capacity and engage in international trade and sort of a whole host of things. So part of my optimism stems from the fact that if the public or a segment of the public loses its infatuation with what has normally in American history been a fringe movement. We've had them on the left and the right, but this is the first time we had one actually take over one of our major political parties and become more pragmatic. I think the word will get around. Democrats had to go through this experience, and Clinton helped them, and Obama followed in that line. I know he's a socialist and was probably born in Kenya, but sort of the fact is Democrats are different now. They've got extreme, they've got some left-wingers. That progressive budget was a zinger to see. Interestingly, the Congressional Black Caucus budget was a much more pragmatic one. So Democrats, Pelosi can deliver her party for a reasonable compromise on the broader budget situation, and it's just got to happen to Republicans. And what started out by looking as if the extreme was going to survive in the states and then come to Washington is, I think you're already beginning to see with the acceptance of the Medicaid component of the Affordable Care Act and some other developments, public-private sort of partnerships, emphasis on education and infrastructure, that there may be a more pragmatic future.
I actually have a... Can you hear me? Okay, there you go. I have a follow-up to that question, actually, sort of in this pragmatic future. The timeline for that is because, you know, you have these governors that are actually doing things, not being invited to CPAC. You have CPAC saying, we're not conservative enough, and then you have the RNC being like, oh no, it's the caucuses and the debates, that's the problem. And I just don't see anything happening until we have sort of another weird, nothing in the midterms, and not until after we have another sort of cluster in 2016 of, you know, these two sides of the Republican Party fighting at each other for any kind of identity. Is this pragmatism? Do you see it possibly happening before, you know, 2020?
Ira, you want to take that?
Well, no, I mean, look, it's not much different than the thing I said earlier. I mean, I do think it's possible that we will see pragmatism before that. I think the effect of the 2012 elections and the fact that the Republicans are fragmenting, and that I think Obama is emboldened by his reelection, gives me the sense that we will have more results in this Congress than one would have expected. I mean, otherwise, I mean, maybe I'm just being naive, although I'm not usually naive, but the notion that, okay, we got to have, let's gear up for another presidential election. I mean, why don't we stop for a minute, worrying about the next presidential election and actually do something now? And I think there is some reason to believe it can happen. One thing I wanted to add, and it's not quite on point, but the comment about Steve Schwartzman and Len's question about taxes. I sometimes get asked, we haven't heard this yet, but isn't the whole system just corrupt? I mean, financial contributions, et cetera. And my answer to that is usually no, it's not really corrupt, but I do think all of us need to be concerned about a financial sector that has too much power. That the financial sector, it's quite remarkable that the financial sector almost plunged the global economy into a depression, and yet minor efforts to regulate it have produced this strong backlash, the Schwartzman statement and the others, the entire Wall Street community that gravitated to the Republicans because Obama had, by the way, saved them. That's, if I were going to look at among the things that has happened in the last 20 years, a financial sector that has really grown out of proportion at a time, and it's no real coincidence, that we have the most shocking pattern of inequality in this country. I mean, our income distribution is quite shocking in comparison to other advanced countries. And that is primarily the effect of a bloated financial sector.
Very powerful. I just want to underscore a point that you made, which supports the notion this is going to take us a while, because I think to send a signal to a party to get it to change, they've got to have successive defeats. And the problem with midterm elections is they almost invariably work for the party out of the White House. And we're coming up on 2014, and once again, this is the class in the Senate was first elected in 2008. And there are many more Democrats vulnerable, many retirements, and McConnell thinks, well, this time they're going to win the majority, so there's still pressure to stick with it. And Republicans in the House also think, you know, the odds are if we keep our troops happy and get them turned out in the midterm election, we're not going to lose our majority, so we don't want to go against our big funders who are pushing this stuff. Some in the financial made their fortunes in the financial community, and that slows down the process of adjustment. But I think another sort of third presidential election defeat, big time, would probably be the precipitating factor in getting new voices in the Republican Party and diminishing those who insist on being holding to extreme views of the world. But in the meantime, that doesn't rule out some mini deals. I mean, a big deal on immigration, but some mini deals on some infrastructure and some modest first cut at tax reform and some changes. I mean, I think we could, if we did it separately, we could get a group together and put the Social Security system on a sustainable basis pretty easily.
I'm going to grab that straw of hope that you just threw out into the stream and use that as the point to end on. I know there are other questions that wanted to get asked, but we'll go have our reception now, and I invite all of you to come and seek out the speakers to ask those questions, and we'll continue the conversation out there. But thanks to the three of you for very insightful.